If you think humans started wearing clothes because they were cold, you're probably wrong. After all, for hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors survived without shirts, jackets, or even shoes. They hunted dangerous animals, crossed harsh landscapes, and slept under the open sky, completely exposed. So, if they managed to survive for so long without clothes, why did they suddenly decide to wear them? The strange part is that scientists didn't discover the answer by finding the world's oldest shirt. In fact, the very first clothes have almost completely disappeared. Instead, one of the biggest clues came from something most people never think about: tiny parasites that have lived alongside humans for thousands of years. Those tiny creatures may have preserved evidence that ancient clothing never could. So, did humans really invent clothes to stay warm? Or is the real story far more surprising? To understand why humans started wearing clothes, we have to travel back to a world where clothing simply didn't exist. Imagine waking up every morning with nothing protecting your skin except the air around you. No jackets during freezing nights, no shoes while walking across sharp rocks, no hats under the burning African sun. Yet, for millions of years, this was completely normal. Every human ancestor lived this way because clothes hadn't been invented yet. What's even stranger is that they weren't constantly freezing to death like most people imagine. They hunted, gathered food, raised children, and survived in environments that seem almost impossible today. Their bodies had adapted to a very different world. By the time our species appeared, humans had already lost most of the thick body hair that covered earlier ancestors, but they still weren't wearing clothes. Evolution had solved one problem, yet created another that wouldn't become obvious until much later. Then, something changed. As humans began exploring new lands beyond Africa, they entered environments their bodies were never designed for. Suddenly, surviving with bare skin became far more difficult than it had ever been before. But was the cold alone enough to make humanity invent clothing? Or was something else pushing them toward one of the greatest inventions in human history? To understand why that happened, we need to go back even further, long before the first human ever thought about making clothing. Millions of years ago, our distant ancestors were covered in thick body hair, much like modern chimpanzees. At first glance, losing that natural coat seems like one of evolution's biggest mistakes. Fur protects against cold, sunlight, scratches, and insect bites. So why would humans gradually lose something so useful? For decades, scientists have debated this question, but most agree on one key idea. Life on the African savanna rewarded staying cool more than staying warm. Unlike many predators, early humans didn't rely on short bursts of speed. Instead, they often practiced what's known as persistence hunting. They would slowly chase an animal for hours under the blazing sun until it became exhausted from overheating. A body covered in thick fur would have trapped enormous amounts of heat, making this strategy almost impossible. By losing most of their hair and developing millions of sweat glands, humans became incredibly efficient at cooling themselves. In a hot environment, that adaptation gave them a huge survival advantage over many other animals. But evolution only solves the problems an organism is facing at that moment. It couldn't prepare humans for places they had never been before. As long as people stayed in warm regions, bare skin worked perfectly. The real problem began when small groups of humans started walking farther and farther from Africa, eventually entering climates where that same bare skin would become one of their greatest weaknesses. Around 70,000 years ago, modern humans began one of the most remarkable journeys in history. Small groups left Africa and slowly spread across the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. They weren't following maps or searching for new continents. They were simply following food, fresh water, and migrating animals. Generation after generation, they traveled farther from the warm climate their bodies had evolved for. At first, The changes were manageable. The nights became colder, winters lasted longer, but eventually they reached places where temperatures could remain below freezing for weeks or even months. For a species that had spent millions of years living in warm environments, this was an entirely new challenge. Imagine standing outside in freezing wind with nothing but your bare skin. Every breath feels painful. Your fingers become numb, your muscles lose strength, and your body begins burning enormous amounts of energy just to stay warm. Unlike mammoths or woolly rhinoceroses, humans had no thick fur to protect them. Unlike bears, they couldn't hibernate through the winter. If they wanted to survive, they needed another solution, one that didn't involve waiting for evolution to grow their fur back. Evolution works over thousands of generations. Humans needed an answer immediately. That urgent need may have sparked one of the greatest survival inventions our species has ever created. But here's where the mystery begins. If clothing became so important to human survival, why haven't archaeologists ever discovered the world's very first outfit? You might expect museums to display humanity's oldest jacket, but instead, the evidence seems to have vanished almost completely. For a long time, scientists assumed the answer was simple. Humans entered colder climates, so they started wearing clothes. At first, that explanation seems perfectly reasonable. But the more researchers studied ancient human migrations, the more they realized the story wasn't that straightforward. After all, humans didn't move into freezing Europe overnight. The journey took thousands of years, giving each generation time to adapt, learn, and develop new survival strategies. They built fires, gathered inside caves, and learned to hunt animals with thick fur. So if these solutions already existed, why wasn't fire enough? Why wasn't shelter enough? Why did clothing eventually become absolutely essential? The problem wasn't just surviving the daytime. It was surviving everything else. Temperatures dropped dramatically after sunset. Freezing winds cut through exposed skin. Rain soaked the body, making it lose heat even faster. Children and older members of the group were especially vulnerable, often unable to produce enough body heat to survive long, bitter winters. Every expedition into colder territory carried enormous risks, and a single night without enough protection could mean death. As humans continued pushing into unfamiliar environments, they needed something they could carry with them wherever they went, something that worked whether they were hunting, sleeping, or traveling across open landscapes. At some point, animal hides stopped being nothing more than leftovers from a successful hunt. They became survival equipment, but proving exactly when that transformation happened turned out to be almost impossible. Unlike stone tools, which can survive for hundreds of thousands of years, the first clothes left almost no trace behind. It seemed as if one of humanity's greatest inventions had simply disappeared from history, until scientists discovered an unexpected witness that had been with us all along. The biggest problem archaeologists faced was surprisingly simple. Clothes don't last. Stone tools can survive buried underground for hundreds of thousands of years. Bones can slowly fossilize under the right conditions. But the materials early humans almost certainly used, animal hides, fur, grass, bark, and plant fibers, begin to rot within years or decades. After tens of thousands of years, almost nothing remains. That's why scientists have discovered countless ancient spear points, knives, and campsites, yet not a single complete outfit from the very beginning of human clothing. It was as if the evidence had vanished, leaving researchers with one of prehistory's greatest unsolved mysteries. For decades, archaeologists searched for indirect clues instead. They studied scraping tools that may have been used to clean animal hides. They examined bone needles that appeared much later in human history. They even looked for tiny wear marks on stone blades that suggested people were cutting leather instead of meat. These discoveries hinted that clothing existed, but none of them could answer the most important question. Exactly when did humans begin wearing it? Every new discovery narrowed the timeline, but the true beginning remained frustratingly out of reach. Then, in a completely unexpected twist, the answer didn't come from an archaeological dig at all. It came from modern biology. Instead of studying ancient clothes, scientists began studying something that had depended on those clothes for thousands of years. Ironically, one of the strongest witnesses to humanity's first clothing wasn't a fossil, a tool, or a piece of leather. It was a tiny parasite that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. That parasite was the clothing louse. At first glance, lice seemed like one of the last places anyone would look for answers about human history. But to evolutionary biologists, they are like tiny, living time capsules. Humans today have two closely related species of lice, head lice and clothing lice. While head lice spend their entire lives in human hair, clothing lice behave very differently. They don't actually live on our bodies. Instead, they hide inside the seams and folds of clothing, crawling onto human skin only long enough to feed before returning to the fabric. Without clothing, they simply can't survive. This gave scientists an incredible opportunity. By comparing the DNA of head lice and clothing lice, researchers could estimate when the two populations split apart from a common ancestor. The results were astonishing. Study after study suggested that clothing lice first appeared roughly 170,000 years ago. That means humans must already have been wearing some form of clothing by then. Otherwise, clothing lice would have had nowhere to live. For the first time, scientists had something they had been searching for decades, not the clothes themselves, but a biological clock pointing to when those clothes almost certainly existed. It's one of the strangest detective stories in science. The world's oldest clothing disappeared thousands of years ago, but the tiny parasites that depended on those clothes survived and quietly carried the evidence in their DNA all the way into the present. Yet, this discovery created another mystery. If humans were already wearing clothes 170,000 years ago, what exactly were those first garments made of, and how did they actually look? Although we'll probably never know exactly what the first clothes looked like, scientists have a surprisingly good idea. They almost certainly weren't carefully stitched shirts, trousers, or dresses like we imagine today. The earliest clothing was likely as simple as an animal hide draped over the shoulders or wrapped around the waist using strips of leather or tough plant fibers. There was no fashion, no decoration, and no concern for appearance. Every piece of clothing had a single purpose: to keep its owner alive for one more day. A successful hunt didn't just provide meat for the group anymore, it also provided a warm skin that could protect a family through freezing nights and dangerous winters. In a very real sense, an animal's hide became just as valuable as its meat. But loose hides had obvious limitations. They slipped while people walked, left large parts of the body exposed, and offered little protection against powerful winds. As humans pushed farther into colder regions, simply throwing a skin over your shoulders was no longer enough. Clothing had to become more practical. It had to fit the body better, trap heat more efficiently, and stay in place while hunting, climbing, or carrying children across long distances. Solving those problems required another invention that, although much smaller than clothing itself, would completely transform the way humans survived in cold environments. That invention was the sewing needle. It may seem like a simple tool today, but without it, the history of human clothing, and perhaps even human civilization, might have looked completely different. Around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, humans began making one of the most important tools in the history of clothing: the sewing needle. Unlike the metal needles we use today, these early versions were carefully carved from bone, antlers, or ivory, with tiny holes drilled into one end for thread made from animal sinew. It may sound like a small technological improvement, but it completely changed what clothing could do. Instead of wrapping loose animal skins around their bodies, people could finally stitch multiple pieces together into garments that actually fit. Sleeves, leggings, and tightly fitted coverings trapped warm air close to the body, making them far more effective against freezing temperatures than a simple hide draped over the shoulders. That single invention dramatically expanded where humans could survive. Places that had once been deadly during winter slowly became permanent homes. Families crossed icy valleys, settled northern forests, and eventually reached regions that would have been nearly impossible to inhabit with nothing more than loose animal skins. In many ways, clothing became a portable shelter. Rather than waiting for evolution to change their bodies over thousands of generations, humans changed their environment with technology instead. It was one of the earliest examples of our species solving a biological problem through innovation rather than evolution. And once clothing became reliable enough to keep people alive almost anywhere, it slowly began serving another purpose, one that had nothing to do with survival. For the first time, what someone wore started saying something about who they were. As the centuries passed, clothing slowly evolved from a survival tool into something much more powerful. Once humans no longer had to worry about simply staying warm, they began changing their clothes for entirely different reasons. Different groups started using different animal hides, colors, feathers, shells, and decorations to distinguish themselves from others. Without speaking a single word, clothing could reveal where someone came from, which community they belonged to, or even how skilled they were as a hunter. For perhaps the first time in history, what people wore became part of their identity. Clothing was no longer just protecting the body, it was beginning to communicate information. This change marked an important turning point in human history. Unlike claws, fur, or sharp teeth, clothing could be improved, customized, and passed down from one generation to the next. Every generation made small improvements over the one before it. Better stitching, stronger materials, warmer designs, and eventually woven fabrics replaced simple animal hides. Long before written language recorded human history, clothing had already become one of humanity's greatest inventions because it allowed people to adapt to almost any environment without waiting for evolution to change their bodies. In many ways, civilization itself was stitched together one piece of clothing at a time. Today, it's almost impossible to imagine leaving home without putting something on first. But the story of clothing didn't begin with fashion, comfort, or style. It began with survival. A species that had lost its fur found another way to protect itself, and in doing so unlocked the ability to spread across nearly every corner of the planet. The next time you put on a jacket, a shirt, or even a simple pair of shoes, remember that you're continuing a story that began hundreds of thousands of years ago, one of the greatest survival stories in human history. So, why did humans start wearing clothes? The answer turns out to be far more fascinating than simply because it was cold. Clothing wasn't invented in a single moment by a single person. It was the result of countless small discoveries made over tens of thousands of years. Humans first lost the thick fur that had protected their ancestors, giving them an advantage in the hot African climate. But when they began exploring colder parts of the world, that same evolutionary advantage became a serious weakness. Instead of waiting for nature to solve the problem, humans solved it themselves. Animal hides became protection. Bone needles turned loose skins into fitted garments. Each generation improved what the previous one had created, and those improvements allowed our species to survive where almost no other primate ever could. Perhaps the most surprising part of this story is how we discovered it. The world's first clothes have almost completely vanished, leaving behind almost no physical evidence. Yet, tiny clothing lice, creatures that most people consider nothing more than pests, quietly preserved one of the greatest clues in human history inside their DNA. Without them, we might never have known when humans first began wearing clothes. It's one of those rare moments where biology answered a question that archaeology couldn't. Today, clothing is so ordinary that we rarely think about it. We wear it for comfort, fashion, work, or self-expression. But every jacket, every shirt, and every pair of shoes is part of a story that began hundreds of thousands of years ago with a simple goal: staying alive. One of humanity's greatest inventions wasn't a machine, a weapon, or a building. It was the decision to cover our own skin. And that single decision helped transform a vulnerable primate into a species capable of living almost anywhere on Earth.